Researching, finding all the things we knew were hiding. And this revelation only opens up more questions.
Hello everyone, and welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education at Liberty University. And with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy at Genesee Community College. It's November, which means it's election season. What better time to discuss politics? While visions of donkeys and elephants may be dancing through your head, I'll advise you ahead of time that this won't be one of those conversations. While talking heads may be turning blue or red in the face, shouting hot air, what we seek to find here is the essence of politics, what constitutes it, how it came to be, and where it's going. Maybe by pulling back the obfuscated curtain of biased rhetoric and looking at the core machinations of the concept, we can learn something valuable about the system and about ourselves. All right, Norm. Well, we're back.
We're back, Joel.
It's been months, and
Yes.
things have changed. We're in a new setting. We have new equipment. I've got a new beard. But things have changed, and things will stay the same as well. But we're going to try something a little bit different with the podcast. We've spent several episodes laying the groundwork of philosophy, and we've gotten some feedback that people have enjoyed it. And now, we want to take a set of topics that are outside that sort of core philosophical centerpiece and kind of examine individual topics and do some philosophizing ourselves. So
Good.
I think it will be interesting going forward. So today we're talking about politics, and politics is obviously a very divisive concept in modern society.
Yes.
If everybody knows what's going on in the news. Even if you're actively not trying to pay attention to what's going on in the news, everybody knows what's going on.
How about if we just start right out? I'm not so sure that everyone does.
Everybody thinks they do, though.
Yes. But there are people who say, I don't pay attention to any of the reports that I hear in the media. So yes, they think that they do, but then that becomes a studied not. I mean, I'm glad we're having this conversation because it shouldn't be about divisiveness. Politics is supposed to be actually the opposite.
Right. And I'm one of those people that, if somebody asks me about politics, I will immediately tell them I don't pay attention. And I think it's just a defense mechanism because there is an obfuscated curtain. There's just a curtain that you pull back and then there's more curtain. And then you're lost in curtains and you're swimming in curtains and you have no idea what's going on anywhere. And I think that that's what happens with the rhetoric that's currently going on. You have this side telling that side that there's fake news or that there's a conspiracy of some kind or all of these different things. And really, what is it all except a distraction from what should be happening, what politics should be? So from a philosophical standpoint, there's a few ways of going about examining a topic. You can use kind of an inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning. You can use the Socratic method, those sorts of things. I think with politics, getting to the essence of politics, what is politics? I think we kind of have to look at, well, what is the initial purpose of it? How does it begin? So do you want to go? Well, what do you think?
Well,
where would you start?
If we just start, if we start with the word, ancient Greek meant affairs of state, or actually affairs of the city, that later became affairs of state. And so that branches rapidly to where we are, but politics is about what is the good of for a collective governance. How should governance adjust in order to look out for the city or the state in ways that help people have livelihoods and interrelationships that are not just productive but healthy.
Okay. So let's really try to define the basics of it then. So if we come down to the very basics of it, philosophy or politics is something that is in regard to relationships.
Yes.
You can't have politics by yourself
No.
in isolation.
No.
So you can't have politics by yourself in isolation. So politics govern relationships. What relationships do they govern? And I think this is where you get into different political philosophies. You know, I think that question will evoke whether or not you're a Marxist or a
Yes. So let's stay away from the isms and ists and as much as we can, because I think that's our intent.
right.
All right. So if we think about just for a moment, Hobbes, Locke, and those folks who, especially Locke, who was Locke essentially said America was the new creation story. A lot of people don't necessarily know that, but that's part of what he was working on. But the idea ultimately is with Hobbes and Leviathan, with Locke, and with us, what are the best relationships that can be cultivated with a steady system of governance? What should government touch and what should government not touch? You know, we go back to the classic. Hobbes said that without any kind of governance, life would be nasty, brutish, and short.
Right.
That we would all eventually just kill each other. And we can go into any number of science fiction
Right, yeah.
things where it all degenerates. I mean, I know this is goofy and maybe you don't want to go here, but I'm just going to toss it and then we can, if you go to something like The Walking Dead, essentially you remove the zombies, what you have is studies, little mini studies like Plato's Republic, of how many different ways clusters of people try to organize to look out after their own best interests and how they approach or don't approach other people to reach out or to keep away for whatever ideas of self-protection or the goodness of the little mini state as it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really relevant example, actually, because what that gets us back to this question. So politics is a moderation of relationships, and I asked what relationships doesn't moderate. So, and like I said, the answer to that question gets you into your different political philosophies. But at its base roots, what is the minimum? What's the minimum qualifications of politics? What relationships does it need to moderate? And so if we ask that question, I think a logical extension of it would be, do animals have politics? If you look at a group of great apes, do they have politics? There's obviously a hierarchy, but does it satisfy the basic principles of politics? Is it just power? Is politics just power? Is that all you need to have a political system?
No. It's a marvelous question. I think not, since we're just talking, not notes and all of that. If it's just power, it is power. But every single relationship since humanity began, I would assert, has been about power. Marriage is about power. Work is about power. The politics of a workplace are just as dynamic on a micro scale as the politics of a city or a state or a country. So the way you put it, I love it. It's the idea of, say it again, moderation.
Yeah, moderating relationships.
Moderating a relationship. So how do you establish a place where people can pursue their own best positive interests without over managing them? How do you moderate a relationship so that people who might not necessarily be willing to give of themselves to others do, so that you can have roads, water systems, and so on? And that leads to taxes, which doesn't need to lead to red, blue, or anything else. It's just looking at you're going to have taxes because people aren't of themselves going to give toward things. I've heard many people, unfortunately, my age and older, who I find it embarrassing to say, but it's not an overgeneralization of an entire generation. That would be wrong to do. But I no longer have kids in school. I shouldn't have to pay school taxes. Well, that betrays the notion that you are no longer part of the community. And the moderated relationship is a community, not a utopia, and not a moralistic place where everyone should be telling everybody else the best way that a community is supposed to be. But the moderation has to be a steady oscillation of interactivity, not assuming that everyone in a system is of the same ilk or of the same need. I think that's where the really interesting part of politics.
Yeah, and I think it is too. And I've really streamlined the outline of the whole podcast show, and I'll let the listeners in on this. Basically, with each topic we're going to look at, I want to figure out the essence of the topic. I want to look at formative issues with the topic, how it began or started, and speculative issues of the topic, what it should be or what it may be. And I think that a lot of the stuff that you mentioned brings me into the speculative part of it, and I don't want to get there just yet.
Okay,
we'll talk about
fine.
it. We'll talk about it towards the end, what politics should be and what it is. But
Yeah.
I think we're still on the essence. Where do we draw the line on what is and isn't politics? So what makes a tribe of great apes? What makes that not politics? They have a leader. They have some functioning group system of survival. Why is it not politics, do you think? What's it lacking?
Well, then I'm going to sound really stodgy and old-fashioned. So no, I'm not, because I'm not suggesting that it lacks something. I'll even back up and not even, I won't suggest that it's not politics, but it's politics within the realm of languages that we don't even necessarily recognize yet as languages. The language is in there.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly there's a hierarchy structure and moderated relationships within them. Who gets kicked out? Who doesn't? In whether it's the bonobos or the chimps or what the great apes, whatever unit you're talking about. So yeah, that's power. I don't know that it's power that is necessarily reflectively altered.
Mm-hmm. No, and I'd agree with that. And, I'm sitting here thinking about it, and even more examples are coming to my mind, and at lower tiers of life forms. And now I'm thinking about ants or termites. These animals build structures, and they have a leading figurehead. Then they have class systems of lower animals who have specific jobs and carry out specific tasks. That's almost a much more advanced system of politics than you'd see in a great ape community. I'm not an expert in animals, and maybe what I said was just completely wrong. I'm sure, the great apes are much more advanced. But I'm just thinking about, if you get into ants or termites or bees and you start to look at these things, I think that they may have the essentials of what you could consider politics, but it's obviously at a different scale. And I think that what you say, the reflective component of it is what separates the scale. And so if these animals have, they have politics maybe, but it's a caste system at the insect level. These animals are born into their roles.
Yes, it's not a moderated system. You're not going to see,
right.
an ant colony that
So
necessarily...
they don't have a decision in it.
No.
But in a monarchy, you may not have a decision, or, in a caste system, you may not have a decision either.
Oh, but you still have the free will.
You
In
do
a
have free
monarchical
will.
caste system, you can decide to rebel against the king. I mean, look at the idea of parliaments. Parliaments, which was really based on the word parley, and would have. I've been reading Jill Lepore's newest history of the United States, and it's just marvelous. Anyway, that's a plug. But parliaments was in England, all right, so way back. You'd meet once every 3 years. It's primarily the nobles meeting to talk, but then they start construing it as, oh, but we're representing our people, and not necessarily for real at first. And then people begin to speak up. And then when you flash forward again, you have colonies on opposite sides of an ocean, or the homeland and the colony, and however you want to construe it. And people looking at rebellions among native peoples against the incoming newbies, and people making choices. I will give up my life to rebel against this, or I will put things at risk in order to do this, or I will do this act, and I know it's going to have consequences. We're not in a position to be able to say that ants or bees or apes necessarily do that.
Yeah, we don't have that kind of insight, at least as far as I know. We don't have that kind of insight into an insect community.
As far
It's
as I know either.
probably pretty fair to assume that they don't. I've never heard of an ant rebellion. Now, with apes, maybe you do. Maybe you, or with a pack of wolves or a pack of apes, maybe there's situations where a leader gets old, or where I think there is.
You're citing your Rudyard Kipling now, aren't you?
Yeah. Maybe reflective thought isn't the correct word, but there's some sort of neurological process that goes on in the animal that triggers or signals something to them that this is an ideal time to attempt to seize power. Or even if it's a beta or a delta animal, to support a different leader. So there is some sort of at that higher level, there's something there. But I think you really kind of struck on it. Perhaps it's the reflective component that separates human politics from animal politics. There's that.
I choose.
It's a conscious, yes, there's a free will, conscious awareness.
I wish, I assert, I ask.
Right. All of those things that we covered talking about consciousness, and that's why those early conversations were important before we delved into something like this, because now you can go back and listen to our consciousness episode and see, oh, okay, well, that's what separates human consciousness from animal consciousness, and that's why human politics are different from animal politics. So we I think we're getting to a little bit about what politics is. It moderates relationships in a reflective way. And the relationships that it moderates sort of determines your political ideology to an extent. For instance, politics, modern politics especially, moderates financial relationships, but it probably didn't have to early in human history when there wasn't finance. There might, in smaller groups, it may not moderate finance. We may have a group of 10 or 12 people, and there's no financial interaction. But it can, I don't think that it has to moderate certain relationships, but it can moderate almost all of them. Mm-hmm. So going from that point, is there relationships that it must moderate? Well, power, I think that you have to have some distribution of power, even if it is a communist sort of society or something like that. There's still an identification of this is a person or a group of people or a board or whatever it is that sort of sets rules, sets expectations, decides a direction of the group.
Which can then be moderated if the system is functioning.
If it has some sort of feedback
system. Input in some way. And, I'm sure it can be, yes, it could be, depending on which iteration, which model you're talking about, it could certainly be negative.
Right.
But But if we're just looking at as value neutraling it, then yes, it's the decision making that says is the hierarchy of needs, or the priority list of needs. Here are the resources that we seem to recognize, even maybe we're not recognizing resources we have, but under the recognition of the resources, how do we use those resources to establish the needs? I mean, I think if you go to Maslow's hierarchy, you've got a pretty adequate, interesting model for political relationship. Basic food, light, safety. Once you've established that, then working your way up the Maslow chain, how do you help people self-actualize?
Yeah, and I think that that's a huge topic that we'll cover when we get to the speculative part of it. I think that people will have strong opinions on that, about whether politics should even have anything to do with the top of the pyramid. And to be honest, I don't think that modern American in politics really cares much about the top of the pyramid, but should it? And that's something we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I think that we kind of have covered, perhaps to the best of our ability, the essence of politics, what politics is. So I think that in a rare instance of genius, we've somehow actually accomplished something. Most of the time we try very hard and we just end up with more questions.
Yeah.
But I think we actually did a pretty good job of figuring out what politics is.
Here.
So let's talk about some formative questions. Why is there politics? So I guess the first question I'd want to ask is, do you think politics is a natural extension of human existence? Or do you think that it's a something that required thoughtful construction from a very early point?
The latter, not the former.
Okay.
It's not natural.
You don't think it's natural?
No, I do not think it's natural, any more than I think logic is natural. We like to think we're very rational, but quite often we're not. And it takes discipline to try to be rational more often, which is back to what Hobbes was saying. So just with the question, no, if politics is an artifice developed to establish the possibility, if not the probability, that we might survive and excel. But let's just stay with the survival. Nobody is completely, not even building computers the way one can, or the most stringent Stoic survivalist is not an island unto himself. He is not a political system, and he is not able to survive in a sense that we would consider to be human in its fullest recognition, in utter isolation.
Okay.
We have plenty of isolationist novels and stories, and throughout our whether you're talking about sacred text or science fiction or ancient stories, whatever. But at base, it's how do we make sure that we don't all kill each other?
Okay, so I'll challenge you on that topic, not because I disagree, but because I think that it's important sort of learning experience for listeners, because, and especially people who haven't listened to the previous podcast, or since we haven't been in the studio in a few months have forgotten recent podcasts. So I think a lot of people might be at home thinking, well, wait a minute, we just talked about animal politics and, the differences and stuff. And so they think, well, maybe politics is a natural thing. Maybe it would just naturally occur, right? And you said that you don't think it's the case because humans are not rational creatures. And I think a lot of people might just be, wait, well, hold on a minute. That doesn't seem right. You need to explain that some more. And I think that we have talked about this in the past. And I think that where it comes back to is that it kind of determines your philosophical outlook on free will. So, and science is starting to fill in the gaps here. You know, neuroscience and a lot of psychology, they're finally starting to come up with empirically measurable ways of determining just how much free will you have in making decisions. And that's where you're coming from. So if you're not in the loop with a lot of those things, I think that it's easy to try to challenge that, to say, well, I'm a rational person. Well, no, I you know, and then that little thought influences the whole train of thought down to the formations of politics. You think, well, no, I think it could be a natural thing because I'm a rational person, and and things would have just happened naturally this way. But when you look at the role that conscious thought plays in actions, and what you find is that a lot of subconscious actions or unconscious actions play a bigger role in how you behave. And neither you or I are behaviorists. I think that, I think it's an antiquated way of thinking. But there's a lot of behaviorist principles are the easiest things to test. And they do shed a lot of very important light on human thought processes. And what you find is that humans do behave in a lot of ways that they're unaware of.
Yes. So really, you're challenging me on this. So I do not assert that we are completely irrational. If we were, we wouldn't be able to be
right. Yeah.
To it. I assert that it's a constant struggle toward self-discipline to be able to look beyond one's immediate needs. That's what politics is. That doesn't mean everyone's going to arrive at the same determination of what the immediate needs are, but that's what the discussion is about. I've been rereading the Federalist Papers. Here are the Federalist Papers, which are written by Adams and Hamilton, and third just went out of my head. But yes, and it was all an attempt to. It was short essays. They all assumed the name Publius so that they would sound nice and scholastic. And it was an attempt to convince New York State, New York residents, not New York State yet, but the colony, of why it needed to consider being part of the one large confederation, not individual states, each like all little monarchies and little countries. And the things that Hamilton writes, because we now know who wrote which ones, as well as the others, are all about the attempts to say, here's why it doesn't work well to have really small, individualistic little places, because they're more likely to go to war with each other. They're more likely to have contrastive economic systems that are going to cause lots of conflict. A whole laundry list of things why an integrated larger state is best for all. It's really one of the first formulations for the public, reaching out to the public in short form to make a case for political unity. And that's where I'm reflecting and rethinking about, wherever one is about where we are now in politics. If you go back to the basics, what were human beings thinking about advancing their needs and their relationships so they could be beyond the survivalist?
Right. And so when we're asking formative questions about politics, why is there politics? We've established that politics is the moderation of relationships, but I think informative politics, in the early days of politics, I think that main relationship that was being moderated was power. And
absolutely.
And then I think that a lot of, the Federalist Papers and, really a lot of 18th century politics was sort of the dawn of modern politics. You can sort of trace back, the dawn of nuclear physics or the dawn of technology. You can see when these things happen. Mm-hmm. And I think you can do so with the political ideology as well. There was a distinct point where it branched out from being, like you were saying, a survivalist or a power-based system into something more than that. And I think that it sort of happened, not by coincidence,
No.
around all, in America and in Europe and other places around the world in that 17th century timeframe, because a lot of these people were communicating.
They were in the Enlightenment. So in the 1700s, they were communicating. They were reading each other. They were talking about things. They missed so much because of the construct of race, which is something else we can talk about later. They missed so very much that the world would be different now if they'd taken that last step, but they didn't do it. But still, when Ben Franklin revises part of the statement in the initial declaration and gives it not a religious and sacred basis for where our rights inherently come from, and made it essentially a rational scientific basis, thus putting it into terms that come from us about why we have certain truths that we think are self-evident, to just talk about our own model. If there are truths that we find self-evident, and these are things that we think then lead to our own necessity as independent agents, and you declare that you are an independent agent, if you are all independent of each other entirely, there is no politics. So the independent agency then frees people up to say, all right, but do we have needs that can we be better as a cluster than we can as individuals? And that's the formative part. And if we can, what questions do we need to ask about how we can be better?
Extremely important, like future altering, is that part that you were just speaking about, Ben Franklin. And he was doing exactly what we were talking about when defining the essence of politics. What relationships should politics moderate? And should religion be one of those relationships? And I think up until that point in history, it was sort of taken for granted that religion should be a relationship that politics should moderate,
and they backed away from
when
it.
they questioned it.
That's right.
And think about how much different things would be, because a lot of the revolutions that have occurred since then, the Industrial Revolution, the Technological Revolution, gender and racial, revolutions, all of these things are results of the political revolution, of what was happening in the 18th century. So these original political philosophers, whether they're American or some of the European ones, that one sentence in the Declaration or in a Constitution or in these things are altering the future course of humankind for better or worse. Because like you said, there are certain racial things and certain gender things that never were addressed and then developed in a way that could have been remediated if it had been addressed.
And even if it yes, and it could have been. But of course, that's ascribing far too much authority to one group of relatively young men in one place where, of course, they are going to be blindsided by their own self-interest. And that's where the other... Politics is a moderation of relationships that I think I would assert in formulaic terms, in formative terms, goes not so well when you don't acknowledge upfront the needs or the perceived needs of the individuals involved. If you can't be upfront that you are denying the very thing that you're saying in your own economic relationships in your private life, but you're making all these grand statements in public, then you have to find a way to justify the negative part of the private life so that it does gel. And that's what politics is a backfilling kind of thing too.
Yeah, you're bringing us up to a super interesting, very important, and highly paradoxical issue of politics, which is this idea that politics is sort of an important evolutionary step in societal relationships. And the very thing that it's attempting to remediate is one's own vested self-interest. You're trying to put that aside for the good of the whole. But while you're doing that, the individuals who are deciding the interest of the whole are still probably subconsciously, in the most ideal of cases, are subconsciously still trying to look out for their own self-interest. And I think that that's where a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of things are happening. We've talked about on the show Confederate monuments and taking them down. And then an extension of that conversation is the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson owning slaves and these sorts of things. And the question arises, where do we draw the line? Where do we stop? Where do we say this person was, a great founding father, or this person was a racist or a misogynist or
you stop throwing things around as if they're pejorative declaration of the entire character of an individual.
Mm-hmm.
I've also been reading a book by Ibram Kendi on anti-racism. He's speaking up in Rochester. And it's just so instructive. Everything I'm reading is, I think about my wife and I have been talking about our whole lived life. And we're reasonably intelligent people, and we read and we read and we examine our experiences, and we've missed all of these other things, the complications that, as you've just described, have led to things that cause more difficulties. But everyone has the capacity and is, at one moment or another, racist.
Mm-hmm.
But if one uses that as gosh, I just said that, didn't I? And whatever it is one has said, you say, where does that come from? Why would I think that? It doesn't become this is what I am character. It becomes a moment of potential instructiveness, which is the formative part of politics.
Exactly. And so that's where the modern conversation regarding politics is very hung up.
Mm-hmm.
Is that there's an attempt by whatever side holds an opinion to cast the other side as holding an opposite opinion that determines the character of the people that hold that opinion, and to use that singular characteristic or viewpoint to infer a large number of other characteristics about a person that also determine that person's character, so that you can take one stand on something that, if I were to tell you that I'm anti-abortion, you could automatically infer a huge number of other things.
As if I just did a visual overlay over you, like
Right.
some Sherlock Holmes episode where all the...
Yeah, and that's not the way it works.
No.
And I'm not saying that I'm anti-abortion. I'm using it as an example.
No, but that's what Kendi says, is that if the moment we verge from looking at shared humanity to assuming behavior for a group, or assuming a universalization of policy stands because of one thought. Ideally, politics is formed, we're talking about the formative, it's not static. It's formed to engender, to create, to push for, however slowly, rethinking. That's not where we are now.
Right. Yeah. So I think that one thing I just want to clarify before we move into the next section, because I think this is a really good segue into the speculative parts of the conversation, is that, when we're looking at historical characters, people throughout history who have had political influence, you just have to, I think that, like you were saying, what ideas are about people are constantly changing. What relationships should be mediated are changing. And I think the idea of politics is always about a whole group, but there is an instinctual part of people that can be conscious, but it can also be subconscious, that wills them to make decisions in their own best interests. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, I think that obviously there's people in the past, Thomas Jefferson and other people, who made bad decisions. And nothing that we are going to say makes what they did right. But should we interpret all of their work through that lens? I think, and I think it depends on the motivation of the original individual.
Not through the lens, but now we're crossing politics to history, and that's okay because they are
right.
But if we were to just dwell in the heroification and simplification, then we've missed anything that we could possibly learn. When we've learned things and we know things about the complexity of the human individuals who were the founders first, let's say, it is not wrong to say, shame on you. Mm-hmm. You missed this. If at the same moment we're saying, shame on us if we find ourselves lingering and doing the same kind of thing symbolically or not. It is to teach us through the horror of humanity, with the brilliance of humanity and the horror of humanity, that we know the stories better and better so that we can do better things with our moderated relationships. Right.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And, it again comes back to a paradox. We need to interpret the actions of people in the past as accurately and honestly as we can.
Yes.
While at the same time, understanding the mystery of consciousness and subjective experience, and knowing that we could never know whether or not they were intentionally or unintentionally making decisions, and whether or not they even understood the impact of the decisions they're going to make. Did Ben Franklin know by changing that one sentence that he could possibly be altering the course of history? He probably did. But that's not to say that all of them knew, or that, or
that's primarily where he dwelt.
Right.
Maybe he has a thought, maybe.
Yeah, but so these are very complex politics, and, especially formal politics is a very complex scenario that involves a lot of the philosophical issues that are just as complex that we covered in the past, whether regarding consciousness, regarding free will, regarding all of these things. So just a last little plug about formative politics. Let's move into the speculative. This is the most fun part. And we've been trying to get there all episode. So talk about the speculative.
Yes.
Let's start with what politics is and will be. What do you think realistically in the modern state, and we'll stick with America because, we don't have to. And I'll tell you why, because I think that's a huge part of it, is that I think that there's a tribalism to politics that probably should be going extinct, because there's technology has made a globalized population. And this is, in doing research for the show, one of the things that I found super interesting was that historians largely regard the formative aspect of politics to come back to warfare originally. And I feel like that is completely antiquated in modern society. I don't think that modern politics revolves around warfare at all, despite all of the warfare that's happening in the world. I feel like warfare plays maybe the smallest part. Outside of basically Africa is the only continent on Earth right now that has shifting borders in a major way. I mean, okay, Russia took a slice of Ukraine a few years ago, and everybody went nuts.
Small thing.
But besides that, in the past 70 years, where have borders changed? Where has warfare really influenced?
How do we measure? I'm putting in quotation marks, air quotes, acceptable losses. This is to reinforce your point. We can't even conceive now, most people, on a regular basis, the staggering losses of life from Roman Empire. Then we have World War I, which you cited, and World War II. But even then, we have the American Civil War, in which we lost more lives than World War I and World War II put together. Now, on a planetary scale, we are less violent. Now, that doesn't serve political interests that want to frighten and scare people and make them think that everyone is trying to kill everybody dead. Right? It's like rage or something. It's not. So that's where, when one doesn't have the enlightened, and I mean that not in an elitist sense, the attempt to enlighten oneself, to learn, to reflect, to say, oh man, that was wrong. That's what's going on? Okay. And to say, no, we have bigger issues than borders, or, we have a planetary issue. Does our planet survive? Of course it does. Are we able to continue surviving on it? That's really problematic across a multi-generational view now. And every time we concentrate on, but if our economics isn't great, we're not going to be making as much money as this or that, then the future does not look good for humanity.
All right, so let's shift gears. Rather than what politics will be, let's start with what politics should be, because I think we kind of have to have that conversation before we move into the other one. So what politics should be? You've touched on a huge part of that, and a lot of modern political philosophy is dealing with these ideas. What is the responsibility of political organizations for climate change? What is the political responsibility of organizations for global justice, for racial equality? That's the question about what politics should be. We started the beginning of this episode, with very minute detail, trying to determine what basic relationships politics should moderate. Now, that system has evolved over tens of thousands of years, and now we're at the point where politics is moderating a large number of relationships, and we're trying to determine what other relationships it should monitor. So, with climate change, this comes back to, all of this really falls under paternalism, which is the idea of, should politics and governing bodies be allowed to restrict free will in order to do what is the best for the members of its body? And that's what climate change falls under. That's what racial and social justice.
It's what economics falls
right.
under.
And so now, and some of these things seem, you'd think that one as big as climate change would be a pretty obvious yes, right? If we don't have a planet, we can't survive.
Reference the earlier rationality thing.
But even that one is controversial, right? Even there's some people that say, well, it doesn't exist or whatever.
There are. But you see, now here comes the elitist, right? It isn't controversial. We have the unmitigated, it's in front of us. We have the scientific evidence. We have everything we need to take action, except the collective will to do so, because it's too expensive and it will lead to too much social change, and we can't wrap our heads around it. And so you must have a political will to do that. But we have individuals. We have cities now, mayors who are attending conferences because our national leaders don't, as an example, on one issue, who are saying, we're moving ahead. We have to. Mm-hmm. We have governors of states attending things like this, saying, we're going to make agreements with you because the larger group doesn't seem able to do so. And then you have the larger group saying, but you can't go that far because that's going to make it harder for the rest of us. And so the politics becomes one of it really becomes the moderated relationship becomes one of what's best for us. So perhaps there is a paternalism in it. I think it's really hard or a maternalism.
Right. So so this, first off, that really highlights the importance of the founding fathers on political systems, because what you just described couldn't have happened in medieval Europe. There was no smaller political body. Well, there was, but there was no overarching political body. You know, you couldn't have changes within a system. There was just a system. So that's interesting. But so let's take paternalism a little bit farther, because it's philosophy and that's what it's about. So I said that climate change, maybe it shouldn't be controversial, but it is. And that probably tips our hand a little bit about our political leanings. So I'm going to immediately put us on the hot seat and say, where does it end? Let's say, so if the government looks at it and says, well, we have plenty of empirical studies that eating red meat causes early death, and we're going to ban red meat. I think that this, now taking it to a level like that, or taking it to an even more absurd level. Oh, more people die in car crashes than any other way, so we're going to outlaw private cars and everything will be public transportation. That sort of thing more highlights the other side's viewpoints, except they take it all the way up to the climate change point. And what that viewpoint is where does government looking out for the good of its citizens, and where does government restricting free choice and being big brother and being a police sort of state, where do you draw that line?
That's exactly back to the formative.
And I think that's where all the arguments come in.
Because the formative says, back to Hobbes and Locke, the formative says, what are you willing to give up in order to continue? Which built into that is, you are going to give some things up in order for the good of the large group. And then we have Kant, bless him, who says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, to use Spock's terms in Star Trek. But more in a more complicated way, what he said was that it can't be the needs of the majority. It has to be the needs of the majority of every stakeholder. Well, that would be humanity.
Right.
Okay. So, yeah, well, red meat and not red meat. We don't see a whole lot of, people can have conspiracy theories all they want to. That clearly is not happening. And people aren't giving up their cars for anything. Okay. Which is leading to other kinds of things. But that doesn't mean that people can't recognize what's around them and what's happening. And for people who worry about that, well, okay, so let's project a bit. Let's say, just what if? Let's take somebody who would be politically saying, I don't believe that this is happening. Do you have a fire alarm? Do you have a smoke detector? Do you actually believe your house is going to burn down? Do you have a generator, or whatever question you want to ask? Well, why would you have that? You don't believe it's going to happen. So why would you have something that could mitigate what is going to happen? Because your rational self says, well, but maybe.
Right.
And so if it's possible, they didn't take probable up, but if it's possible that within the space of 5 or 4 generations, there's not too many greats after grandpa with that you're going to have an influx of millions of people who no longer have land to live on because it disappeared under the water. You're going to have influxes of people for water refugees, who have no water at all. You're not going to have power in places that had it. We already see that in California because of more and more wildfires. And so a political system is remiss if it doesn't look at what we know and try to ask the questions of people. Say, we know this. What are you willing to give up in order to make the next step not happen? That's the dialogue that isn't happening. The denials or the accusations is not political dialogue. Political dialogue is, you believe in being ready? What are you willing to do in order to be ready?
Exactly. And I love that what you're talking about with Hobbes is exactly what the political conversation should be, rather than denial or accusations or reducing things to a single viewpoint. Just asking, what are you willing to give up to make society or make the world work?
Or are you willing to?
Right. And the fact is, climate change is inevitable because, we have scarcity of resources. Like that's an indisputable fact. We don't have an endless planet. Like there's no arguing that at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's less a question of if it's real than when it will become real, And so if you take scarcity of resources and you take an increasing population, then at some point these terrible things will happen. Then the question is, well, when will they happen? What are we willing to do to take these actions? Like you said, are we even willing to? And so I think that's kind of that. What should politics be? What role should it enforce things? Should it ask people their idea? Here's what I've talked about people with this before, and some people think it's kind of crazy sounding, but it's really America is sort of unique among the world where we kind of revere the founding fathers in our original Constitution and things where it's almost put on a pedestal above beyond reproach. A lot of other countries write new constitutions or do new things, recognizing that some things are outdated. Well, we live in a republic. We have a representational republic. And you alluded earlier to people should not be allowed to make decisions that affect others and not themselves. And I think that nobody would really argue that that's not happening in American politics. And on top of that, we have technological innovations that founding fathers never could have dreamed of. Right? So what's to prevent us from becoming a actual democracy, a pure democracy, right? Let's say we have a technological, you have an app on your phone, we have all this stuff and everybody can register a vote for different topics within a given time frame. And each individual voice is heard, and we go upon what the majority of people vote for, right? Obviously, it would have to be much more complex than that. But like, it comes back to what should politics be? Should we be a representative republic? Should we be a democracy? How should we go about answering these questions of what should politics address?
We have to ask things about questions of authority, and this is what the philosophers who were influencing the founders were doing. If you go to a strict democracy, then you put yourself in the position of assuming that everyone is an expert on everything and that they won't put their own needs first every single time. And those are very unlikely circumstances.
Right. So
psychologically.
So what's happened is we started with power and we started with self-interest and we're ending with power and self-interest.
Yes.
So if you give people a democracy and they understand that their individual vote matters, they're always going to vote in their self-interest and not the interest of...
Not necessarily always, but unpredictably.
Right. So maybe that doesn't work, right? So the next question would be, or the next logical extension, and this is another major topic in political philosophy today, is should we be an epistocracy? Which, an epistocracy is a democracy, but only among intellectual elites.
Yeah, and my first response as probably somebody who falls in that category is no either. That's why we've got a democratic republic. We have a president who was not elected by the majority of the people, but by part of the other systematic things put in place. And depending on which side you're on, people would argue tooth and nail about why that is good or why that isn't good. No single group should have complete authority over what the needs are for everyone. But the authority of knowledge has to be returned in order. I mean, that's vital. If you have the moderation relationship without knowledge, then you are inviting a self-referential the belief. I believe it, and therefore it's right, which does not lead to good decisions.
Right.
And if you have an elitist, then you say, people say, well, nobody's even thinking about me, which is why we have such populist rises across the planet right now. It has to be that complicated intermeshing to hear what people so-called on the ground are saying, but then to moderate that with what knowledge that those folks don't necessarily have.
Right. So, we've looked
By
at
telling them what you know.
Right. So we've looked at it and we've decided, epistocracy isn't a good view. A total democracy isn't a good view. Obviously, almost every political system has a flaw of some kind because of how it works out. So this idea of everybody needs to have a voice.
How is the voice given?
Right. Yeah. All these things, and I think that's where we're sort of at a turning point with American politics. Is I think that, while not being perfect, obviously, I think that in the past, that intermeshing has happened to some extent. I think that common people were being heard and ideas and policies were being filtered through scientific validation, those sorts of things. And I think it's really just recently that some of those things are starting to break down. And
we have right now a very dangerous situation on a planetary scale, not just in the United States, where the value of knowledge and the authority of fact, and that's not a simple thing either, I'm not suggesting it is, but are being degraded, derided, deposed for what people want to believe. And that's not good for the very people who want to believe that. So that implies a paternalism, which you don't want a king. That didn't work out so well either.
Right.
But that's where it has to be a constant flow, not out of static, this is our position on things, vote for me because this is my position. But here we are, a cluster of people, some with more knowledge, some less, and we are willing to hear everything to constantly make changes in our policy to adjust for what's the best for every group represented.
right.
That's messy.
So yeah. And so that leads us into the last part, which is what will politics be? So I think the big question there is based off of what you just said, do you think it's possible? Do you think that as a group as large as a political organization can be as nimble enough to hear all of the voices and figure out what should be implemented and actually carry through it? Do you think that in our modern society, that's a possible thing?
I used to think so. And I want to think so. But I see an awful lot of things mitigating against that. I have to be optimistic because I have a grandchild, one so far. I can't. And adult children are doing remarkable things in their own corners of the world. And I can't just give up because that would be just way too simple. But I don't see a lot of optimistic things happening right at the moment. And I feel like we are at a tipping place where we can't stay on that tipping place any more than a stone. Sooner or later, it's going to go one direction or the other. How about you?
Yeah, no, I think that your estimation of this is just right. And I think what it boils down to is that humans live on such short time scales that I think we look at things And we assume that because things have been a certain way, they'll always be that way, whether it's in nature or in politics or whatever it may be. When in reality, the history of the universe, of the world, of humankind is change. Things do not stay the same, you know? And so I think that despite the fact that there's been a system that's worked for the past several hundred years with some modification, I think that we've reached a point where there needs to be fairly significant modifications that people are not willing to make. And when people are not willing to make those modifications, they tend to have a way of forcing people to make those modifications.
You know,
and it's not always
and you're
pleasant.
saying this very well. You're saying this to me. You're saying this lucidly. This is where we were talking before we started about the science fiction stories. What is the most common model in the science fiction of what happens in the next stages of humanity? Well, the planet goes down, corporations take over because national governments just aren't able to do it anymore, corporations being multinational. So the world becomes corporate entities, which then extends out into space. Some corporations own this, some corporations, and then there are corporate wars, and then there are corporate social. And so rather than a nation, then it's a corporation that you become loyal to. And that's not a very pretty picture either.
Right.
But it depends on what does one acknowledge as the economic. For so many people, it's the immediacy and even in the long term of the economic. Well, governments aren't great at developing and manipulating economies. Corporations, maybe not necessarily either, but they seem to be a lot more cutthroat and savvy about it. So we may end up going to corporate models. I don't want that, but
Right. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because economics is one of the topics that I want to cover in future episodes.
Good.
And that's like the perfect teaser, because it's like we'll discuss economics in the same way we discussed politics. But you know, the last final thought for people to think about until we get to that episode is scarcity of resources again.
Mm-hmm.
It's that thing that's always lingering in the back of my mind, at least when thinking about it, is the goal of economics is to increase consumption, essentially. You know, we need to produce more
and
to
buy
consume
more. Yes.
And so even if corporations are better at producing and consuming than governments, maybe that's just speeding us towards a demise if we don't find a way, at least, to become an interplanetary society. In which case, there's still scarcity of resources in the universe. There's no good end to this.
There's
story.
no good end to this story billions of years from now.
Right. But in our small little microcosm on our tiny dirt ball in space, that's something to be thinking about. And economics, I think, will be a very interesting episode. So we'll dive into that next time. But thanks for listening. And until next time, keep pondering.